Hey there, welcome to English in Fluency. I am so glad you are here today, because what we are going to do together is something that most English learners never really focus on, and it is honestly the one thing that makes the biggest difference when you are trying to have a real conversation with someone. You see, a lot of people spend hours and hours learning vocabulary words and studying grammar rules, and that is great, that is important, but there is this huge gap between knowing English and actually understanding English when it is spoken naturally in real life. And that gap is all about follow-up comments. When someone says something to you, the conversation does not just stop. The other person responds, and then you respond. And then they add something new. And the idea keeps growing and changing and developing. And if you cannot follow that natural development, you get lost pretty quickly. So today, I want to take you through a really special, deep listening practice session where you are going to hear natural conversations, and I am going to help you understand exactly how ideas build on each other, how people add new information, how they agree or disagree gently, and how a simple comment can turn into a whole interesting discussion. This is going to change the way you listen to English. I really believe that. So just relax, get comfortable, and let us jump right in. Before we get to the conversations, I want you to understand something really important about how native speakers talk. When you are learning English in a classroom, the sentences are nice and clean and complete. Someone asks a question, someone gives a full answer, and everything is very neat. But real life is not like that at all. In real life, people start a thought and then change direction halfway through. They add little pieces of information that are connected to what was just said, but maybe not in an obvious way. They use short responses like, "Oh, really?" or "No way," or "That makes sense." And these little responses are actually doing a lot of work in the conversation. They show the listener is paying attention, they show agreement or surprise, and they give the speaker a signal to keep going. So when you are listening to English, you need to train your ear to catch not just the main sentences, but also these small follow-up comments, because that is where the real meaning of the conversation lives. If you only listen to the big sentences and ignore the small ones, you will understand the words, but you will miss the feeling and the direction of the conversation. And that is what makes you feel like you are not really getting it, even though you know all the vocabulary. Imagine two friends, Maya and Daniel, sitting in a coffee shop on a Saturday morning. Maya has just told Daniel that she decided to quit her job last week. Daniel says, "Wait, seriously, you actually did it? I mean, I knew you were thinking about it, but I did not think you would go through with it so soon." And Maya says, "Yeah, I know. It felt really sudden, even to me. But honestly, I had been feeling unhappy for months. And one morning, I just woke up and thought, why am I still doing this?" And then Daniel says, "So what did your manager say? Were they upset?" And Maya says, "Actually, no. That is the crazy part. She was really understanding. She even said she had noticed I seemed stressed lately, and she was kinda relieved in a way, because she could see it was not working out." And understanding this exact moment is everything, because this is precisely what I mean when I talk about ideas developing naturally. Look at how this conversation moved. It started with a big piece of news, Maya quitting her job. Then Daniel responded with surprise, which is a totally natural follow-up because quitting a job is surprising. But notice what he did next. He did not just say, "Oh wow, that is big news," and then sit there in silence. He added a specific detail. He said he knew she was thinking about it, but did not expect it so soon. That detail shows he has been paying attention to Maya's life. It shows their friendship has history. And it also opens the door for Maya to explain why she did it now instead of later. And then Daniel asked a follow-up question about the manager, which moved the conversation in a new direction. He could have asked about money or about what she will do next, but he chose to ask about the manager. And that choice tells us something about what he thinks is important in this situation. And then Maya's response about the manager being understanding added another layer to the story that nobody could have predicted. Then the conversation continues, and this is where it gets really interesting because Maya adds a follow-up comment that shifts the whole feeling of the discussion. Maya says, "And the thing is, now that it is done, I feel this huge sense of relief, like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders. But at the same time, I am also a little scared because I do not have a plan yet." And Daniel says, that is completely normal though, right? Like you cannot expect to feel 100% confident right after making a big change like that. And then he adds, "My sister went through something similar last year when she left her marketing job, and for the first 2 weeks she was excited, and then she totally panicked. But then she ended up finding something way better." Listen to what Daniel just did there, because this is a masterclass in natural follow-up comments. First, he validated Maya's feelings by saying that is completely normal, which is a really important kind of follow-up because it makes the other person feel heard and understood. But then he did something even more valuable. He shared a personal story about his sister that connects directly to what Maya is experiencing. This is one of the most common and most powerful ways that ideas develop in English conversation. Someone shares a feeling or a situation, and the other person responds not just with words of comfort, but with a real example from their own life that shows they truly understand. And notice how his story about his sister also added new information. The part about being excited first and then panicking, which gives Maya a roadmap of what she might expect in the coming weeks. That is so much more useful than just saying, "Do not worry, everything will be fine." The follow-up comment carried real substance and moved the conversation forward in a meaningful way. Then Maya responds to Daniel's story and says, "Oh, that actually makes me feel a lot better, because I think part of my fear is that I am the only one who feels this way, like everyone else has it all figured out, and I am just messing up." And Daniel says, "No, no, no. Trust me. Nobody has it all figured out. That is literally the biggest lie we tell ourselves, and honestly, I think the people who look the most confident are sometimes the ones who are the most lost." And Maya laughs and says, "Well, that is either very comforting or very terrifying. I cannot decide which one." And Daniel laughs too and says, "How about a little bit of both?" This exchange is beautiful because you can see how an idea developed from something practical, a job situation, into something deeper and more emotional, the feeling that everyone else has life figured out. And this happened through follow-up comments. Maya's comment about feeling like she is the only one opened up a new direction, and Daniel's response about nobody having it figured out took that idea and expanded it into something more universal. And then Maya's little joke at the end, saying it is either comforting or terrifying, is a perfect example of how English speakers use humor to handle emotional moments. She did not get deep and serious about it, she kept it light, and that is such an important skill in conversation. When you can follow that shift from serious to humorous, you are really understanding English at a deep level. I want you to think about what you just heard and how it applies to your own listening practice. When you are watching a movie or talking to someone in English, and the conversation starts going in a direction you did not expect, do not panic. That is not you failing to understand. That is just how conversation works. Ideas grow and change and sometimes take surprising turns, and the key is to listen for those small connecting phrases that show you where the conversation is heading. Phrases like "the thing is," or "honestly," or "that reminds me," or "the crazy part is," these are all signals that someone is about to add a follow-up comment that will develop the idea in a new way. When you hear those phrases, your brain should perk up and pay extra attention because something important is coming. And the more you practice listening for these signals, the easier it becomes to follow even really complex conversations. I want you to shift your imagination now to a completely different setting, an office kitchen, where two co-workers named Priya and Tom are making coffee during a short break. Priya says, "Have you seen the email about the new project yet? Because I just read it, and I am not going to lie. It sounds like a lot of extra work for us." And Tom says, "Yeah, I skimmed it this morning, but I did not read it that carefully. What exactly did it say?" And Priya says, "Basically, they want us to start doing monthly reports for the client instead of quarterly ones. And we also have to include all these extra data points that we have never tracked before." Right away you can hear the tone of this conversation is different from the first one. This is not two friends chatting casually. This is two people dealing with a work situation that affects them directly. And Priya's follow-up comment, after Tom asked what the email said, is a great example of how to give information clearly in a follow-up. She used the word basically to signal that she is about to summarize something complex, and then she broke it down into two clear pieces: the monthly instead of quarterly reports, and the new data points. That is a really effective way to develop an idea in a conversation, by breaking it into parts so the listener can absorb it easily. Then Tom responds and says, "Oh, that is annoying. Because quarterly reports already take up so much time, I cannot imagine doing them every month. Who even asked for this change?" And Priya says, "Apparently, the client mentioned it in their last meeting, and our manager agreed without really checking with the team first," which is frustrating. And Tom says, "That is typical, honestly. Decisions get made above our heads, and then we just have to deal with the consequences." Listen to how this conversation is developing, because it is following a pattern that you will hear all the time in English. They started with a specific issue, the new reporting requirements. Then Tom responded by expressing annoyance and adding his own perspective about how quarterly reports already take too much time. Then Priya added more context by explaining why the change happened. The client asked for it, and the manager agreed. And then Tom took that information and turned it into a broader comment about how decisions get made without involving the team. So the idea went from something very specific, an email about reports, to something more general, the way their workplace operates. And that progression happened entirely through follow-up comments, each person taking what the previous person said and adding a new layer to it. But then the conversation takes a turn, and this is the part I really want you to pay attention to. Priya says, "Okay, but let me tell you something interesting. I actually mentioned to Sarah last month that we should think about doing more frequent reports because the client always seems surprised by the quarterly numbers." And Tom says, "Wait, so you suggested this, and now you are complaining about it?" And Priya says, No, I suggested more frequent updates, like a quick email every month, not a full report, with all this extra data. There is a huge difference. This is such a natural moment in a conversation, and it happens all the time." Priya revealed something that changes how we understand the whole situation. She was not completely against the idea of more frequent communication with the client. She had actually suggested something similar herself. But her follow-up comment clarified that what she suggested was different from what actually happened, and that distinction is really important. The idea developed from a simple complaint about extra work into a more nuanced discussion about what kind of communication would actually be useful. And Tom's response, "Wait, so you suggested this," shows he is following the logic and connecting the dots, which is exactly what a good listener does in a conversation. His follow-up comment was not adding new information, it was showing that he understood the implication of what Priya just said. Then Tom says, "So maybe we could talk to the manager and suggest a middle ground, like a short monthly update instead of a full report, since you already had that idea before." And Priya says, "I would be open to that, but I do not want it to look like I am complaining." You know how it is. Sometimes when you push back on something, people act like you are not being a team player. And Tom says, "That is true, but I think if we frame it as trying to be more efficient, rather than trying to do less work, they might respond better." And Priya says, "That is actually smart. Yeah, we could say we want to streamline the process, so the client gets timely information without us spending unnecessary hours on full reports every month." Look at how this conversation has transformed. It started as a complaint about extra work, and through a series of follow-up comments, it became a problem-solving discussion. Tom's suggestion to find a middle ground shifted the energy from negative to constructive. Priya's concern about how it would look added a realistic layer about workplace politics. And then Tom's framing idea gave them a concrete strategy. Each follow-up comment built on the previous one and moved the conversation forward. And if you had stopped listening after the first few exchanges, you would have missed the best part, where they actually came up with a plan. This is exactly why following the development of ideas is so important, because the most valuable parts of a conversation often come later, after the initial topic has been explored and the speakers start building on each other's thoughts. There are basically two types of follow-up comments you will hear as you listen to English. The first type is the kind that adds new information, like when Priya told Tom that the client had asked for the change and the manager agreed. That was a new fact that moved the story forward. The second type is the kind that adds new perspective, like when Tom said, "That is typical. Decisions get made above our heads." He did not add any new facts, but he added his interpretation of the situation. And that interpretation shaped how the rest of the conversation went. Both types are important, and the best conversations have a mix of both. When you are practicing your listening, try to notice which type of follow-up each comment is. Is the person adding new information, or are they adding their perspective? Once you start recognizing this pattern, you will find that conversations become much easier to follow because you will understand the structure underneath all the words. Now picture a dinner party with 3 people, Sophie, Leo, and Nina, who have just finished eating and are talking about travel experiences. Sophie says, "I finally went to Japan last month, and it was honestly one of the best trips of my life. The food alone was worth the ticket price." And Leo says, "Oh, I am so jealous. Japan has been on my list for years, but I keep putting it off because it seems overwhelming to plan." And Nina says, "It is not that bad, actually. I went 2 years ago, and I managed to plan the whole thing in about a week, using just a few blogs and Google Maps." Notice how each person's comment built on the previous one in a different way. Sophie started with her experience and a specific detail about the food. Leo's follow-up connected to the topic, Japan, but added his own feeling about it, that it seems overwhelming to plan. And then Nina's follow-up directly addressed Leo's concern by sharing her own experience of planning the trip easily. So within just 3 short exchanges, the conversation has already developed from a simple story about a trip into a practical discussion about how difficult it is to plan that particular trip. Then Sophie says, "The planning was actually my favorite part. I spent weeks researching restaurants and neighborhoods, and I made this whole spreadsheet, which I know sounds ridiculous, but it made the trip so much better because I knew exactly where I wanted to go every day." And Leo says, "Okay, you are speaking my language now, because I am definitely a spreadsheet person. I plan everything. Like, when my friends and I went to Spain, I made a spreadsheet for restaurants, with ratings and notes and everything." And Nina says, "See, that is where we are different, because for me, half the fun is wandering around and discovering things by accident. Like in Japan, we found this tiny ramen place down an alley that was not in any guidebook, and it ended up being the best meal we had the whole trip." This is fascinating because you can see 3 different personalities coming through in the follow-up comments. Sophie's follow-up revealed that she is a planner, and she is almost apologizing for it by saying, "I know it sounds ridiculous." Leo's follow-up immediately connected to that by identifying with the spreadsheet approach, which builds a sense of similarity between them. And Nina's follow-up respectfully disagreed by presenting an alternative approach, the wandering approach, and she supported it with a specific example from her own trip. Then Leo says, "I see your point about discovering things by accident, but my problem is that I get anxious when I do not have a plan. Like I will walk around for an hour trying to find somewhere to eat, and by the time I pick a place, I am already in a bad mood." And Nina says, "But do you think that is because you are not used to it? Like, maybe if you practiced being more spontaneous, it would get easier." And Leo says, "Maybe, but also, I think some people are just wired differently. Like my partner is exactly like you. She loves just wandering and exploring, and she always tells me to relax and go with the flow. But that is just not how my brain works." And Sophie says, "I think there is room for both, though. Like what I do is I plan the main things, like dinner reservations and big activities, but I leave the afternoons open, so if I find something interesting while walking around, I can just do it." This is a perfect example of how follow-up comments can lead to a really rich discussion. Leo shared something personal about his anxiety, which is a vulnerable thing to do in a conversation. Nina pushed back gently by suggesting it might be a matter of practice. Leo pushed back just as gently by saying he thinks people are wired differently. And then Sophie came in with a compromise that took elements from both sides. The conversation developed naturally from three people sharing travel preferences into a discussion about personality types and how different people experience the world differently. And every step of that development happened through follow-up comments that added something new to the discussion. Then Nina says, "You know what? I never thought about it that way, combining planning with flexibility, because I always saw it as either you are a planner or you are not. But your approach is actually really smart." And Leo says, "Yeah, I could see that working for me too. Like if I knew I had my dinner sorted, then I could relax during the day and not stress about finding food." And Sophie says, "Exactly." And the beautiful thing is that when you leave space for spontaneity within a planned trip, the spontaneous moments feel even more special because they are unexpected. What just happened here is that Nina changed her position slightly because of what Sophie said. Leo found a way to apply Sophie's approach to his own situation. And Sophie added a philosophical note about why the mixed approach works well. The conversation has come full circle in a way, starting with three different opinions and ending with a shared understanding that combines the best of all three. And this entire journey happened through follow-up comments, where each person listened to what the others said and responded thoughtfully. When you can follow this kind of development in English, you are not just understanding words, you are understanding people, and that is the real goal of listening practice. I want to give you a little challenge right now. Think about a recent conversation you had in your own language, maybe with a friend or a family member, and try to remember how the ideas developed. Did the conversation stay on one topic the whole time, or did it branch off into different directions? Did anyone share a personal story that changed the direction? Did anyone disagree and then find common ground? When you start noticing these patterns in your own language, it becomes much easier to notice them in English. Because the truth is, the way ideas develop in conversation is pretty similar across all languages. People share, people react, people add, people disagree, people find connections. The words are different, but the structure is the same. So trust your instincts as a communicator and let them guide you as an English listener. Now shift your mind to a video call between two friends, Rachel and Kevin, where Rachel has just moved to a new city. Kevin says, "So how is the new place? Have you started to settle in at all?" And Rachel says, "Sort of. My apartment is fine, and I have figured out where the grocery store is and the basics like that, but I have not really made any friends yet, and that is the part that is harder than I expected." And Kevin says, "Yeah, that is always the toughest part of moving. Like the practical stuff you can figure out pretty quickly, but building a social life from scratch takes time." And Rachel says, "It does, and I think what makes it harder is that everyone at my new office already has their friend groups. So it is not like people are unfriendly, but they are not exactly going out of their way to include me either." Kevin's follow-up comment is important here because he did two things. He validated her experience by saying, "That is always the toughest part." And he added his own understanding of why it is hard, the difference between practical stuff and social stuff. That combination of validation and insight is a really powerful kind of follow-up, because it shows the speaker that you truly get what they are going through. Then Kevin says, "Have you tried any of those apps where you can meet people who are also new to the city? Because my cousin used one when she moved to Berlin, and she said it was really helpful." And Rachel says, "I downloaded one, but I have not actually gone to any of the events yet, because honestly, the idea of going to a social event alone where I know nobody sounds kinda terrifying." And Kevin says, "I totally get that, but maybe you could start small. Like just go to a coffee meetup instead of a big evening event, something low pressure, where you can just sit and listen and leave whenever you want." Kevin's follow-up here is really skillful. He could have just said you should try the app, which would have been a dead end. Instead, he acknowledged Rachel's fear by saying, "I totally get that," which kept the conversation feeling safe and supportive. And then he offered a specific practical suggestion that addressed her exact concern. The follow-up did not dismiss her feelings. It worked with them. And this is something you will hear a lot in good English conversation. The best follow-up comments acknowledge what the other person said before adding something new. It is like the person is saying, "I hear you, and here is something else to think about." Then Rachel says, "That is actually a good idea. There is a coffee morning thing this Saturday that I saw on the app. Maybe I will just go for 30 minutes and see how it feels." And Kevin says, "Yes, 30 minutes is nothing. You can totally do that." And honestly, most people at those events are in the exact same situation as you, so they will probably be relieved that someone else is there. And Rachel says, "You know what? You are right. I am probably not the only one who feels nervous about this, and I think I have been building it up in my head to be this huge, scary thing, when really it is just coffee with some strangers." This is such a beautiful moment in the conversation because you can see Rachel's mindset changing in real time. Kevin's follow-up about most people being in the same situation gave her a new way to think about the event. Instead of being the outsider walking into a group of friends, she could see herself as one of many new people, all looking for connection. And her own follow-up comment shows that she has reframed the situation in her mind. The idea developed from feeling isolated and scared to feeling like part of a shared experience. And that shift happened because both people were engaged in the conversation and building on each other's thoughts. Then Kevin says, "And remember, you can always call me after if it is awkward. I want to hear all about it, the good parts and the bad parts." And Rachel says, "You are the best. Honestly, just talking about this with you has made me feel better. I think I was sitting here feeling sorry for myself, and I just needed to say it out loud to someone." And Kevin says, "That is what I am here for. And hey, once you make some friends there, you will have to show me around because I have never been to your new city." And Rachel says, "Deal. I will be your personal tour guide as soon as I figure out where things are myself." The conversation has shifted from a heavy emotional topic to something lighter and more hopeful. And that shift happened naturally through follow-up comments. Kevin's offer to be there for her reinforced the friendship. Rachel's admission that just talking helped showed vulnerability and gratitude. And Kevin's final comment about visiting turned the whole conversation toward the future in a positive way. Picture another setting now, a gym, where two people named Lena and Omar have just finished a workout class and are chatting as they pack up their bags. Lena says, "That class was so much harder than last week. I think the instructor changed the routine because my legs are shaking right now." And Omar says, "Oh, definitely. I noticed the same thing. There were way more squats today, and that last set with the jumps was brutal." And Lena says, "The jumps killed me. I had to stop halfway through because I just could not keep going. And I felt a bit embarrassed about it, honestly." This is a really natural start to a conversation between people who share an activity. They bonded over the shared experience of a difficult workout. And then Lena did something interesting in her follow-up. She admitted something slightly vulnerable, that she had to stop and felt embarrassed. Omar says, "No, do not feel embarrassed. I basically sat out the last 30 seconds of that set too. I think everyone was struggling. Like I looked around the room and nobody was doing those jumps perfectly." And Lena says, "Really? Because in my head, I was the only one who could not do it. But now that you mention it, I was so focused on my own struggle that I was not really looking at anyone else." And Omar says, "That is the thing about these classes. Everyone thinks everyone else is doing great. But actually, most people are just trying to survive. At least, that is what I tell myself." Omar's follow-up was really important here. He could have just said, "Oh, do not worry about it," in a dismissive way. But instead, he shared that he also struggled, which made Lena feel less alone. And then he added the observation about looking around the room, which gave evidence to support his point. And Lena's follow-up was equally interesting because she reflected on her own thinking process, realizing that she was comparing herself to others without even looking at them. Then Lena says, "So do you come to this class every week? Because I have only been coming for about a month, and I am still trying to build a routine." And Omar says, "I have been coming for about 3 months now, and I will be honest, the first month was rough, like I could barely walk after some of these classes, but it does get easier, I promise." And Lena says, "That is good to hear because some days I wonder if I am just not fit enough for this level." And Omar says, "It is not about being fit enough. It is about showing up consistently. Like the instructor always says, it is not about being perfect. It is about being present." And honestly, that applies to pretty much everything in life, not just exercise. This conversation has taken a really nice turn. It started with a comment about a difficult class, moved through a moment of vulnerability, and now it has become a motivational exchange where Omar is encouraging Lena to keep going. And his final follow-up, where he connected the instructor's saying about being present to life in general, elevated the conversation from a simple chat about exercise to something a bit more meaningful. Something that I see a lot of English learners struggle with is knowing when to speak in a conversation and when to just listen. When you hear a really good follow-up comment, your first instinct might be to respond with something equally good, and that is natural. But sometimes the best thing you can do is give a short response and let the other person keep talking. Responses like, "Oh, that is interesting," or "Tell me more about that," or "I had not thought of it that way," these are not weak responses. They are actually really powerful because they show the other person that you are engaged and that you value what they are saying, and they give the conversation room to breathe and develop naturally. So when you are practicing your listening, do not just listen for the long, detailed follow-up comments. Also, listen for these short, encouraging responses, because they are doing important work in the conversation, even though they do not contain a lot of words. Imagine two neighbors, Chloe and Sam, running into each other in the hallway of their apartment building. Chloe says, "Hey Sam, did you hear all that noise last night? It sounded like someone was moving furniture upstairs at like 2 in the morning." And Sam says, "Yes, I heard it too. I actually almost went up there to say something, but then it stopped after about 20 minutes, so I just went back to sleep." And Chloe says, "I am glad it stopped, but this is like the third time this month. And I do not want to be the complaining neighbor, but it is starting to affect my sleep." And Sam says, "I hear you. And I have been thinking about talking to the building manager about it, because it is not just the noise. There has also been some issues with the trash room and the front door not closing properly." This conversation started with a very specific complaint about noise, and through follow-up comments it is already developing into a broader discussion about building issues. Chloe's comment about it being the third time added weight to the problem. Sam's response showed agreement, and then expanded the scope by mentioning other issues. Then Chloe says, "Oh, I did not know about the other issues. But yeah, the trash room has been pretty bad lately. Like last week there were bags just left in the hallway, outside the room, because it was apparently full." And Sam says, "Exactly. And the thing is, I really like living here, and I do not want to move. But if these small problems keep adding up, and nothing gets fixed, it is going to start feeling like the management does not care about the building." And Chloe says, "That is a good way to put it. It is not about one big problem. It is about the accumulation of small ones that makes you feel like you are not being taken seriously as a resident." This is a really sophisticated development of ideas. Sam took the conversation from specific complaints to a general principle by saying the small problems keep adding up. And then Chloe refined that idea even further by using the word accumulation and framing it as a matter of being taken seriously. Neither of these people used complicated language, but their follow-up comments showed real thinking about the situation. Then Sam says, "So would you be up for signing something together? Like a polite note to the manager outlining the issues? Because I think if it comes from multiple residents, they might take it more seriously." And Chloe says, "Yeah, I would definitely sign that. And maybe we could mention it to a few other people in the building too, like the woman on the third floor who always says hello in the elevator. She might have noticed things as well." And Sam says, "Great idea. I will draft something this week and maybe we can catch people in the lobby over the weekend to see if anyone else wants to add their name." And Chloe says, "Perfect. And you know what? I actually feel better already, just knowing that we are going to do something about it, instead of just sitting here being annoyed." The conversation has moved from identifying a problem to planning a solution, and that transition happened through collaborative follow-up comments. When you give a follow-up comment in English, you have a choice about what kind of contribution you want to make. You can add information, perspective, emotion, a question, a connection, or humor. The best conversationalists use all of these types, switching between them naturally depending on what the moment calls for. Now, I want you to listen in on two friends, Grace and Ben, who are talking about a movie they both just watched. Grace says, "So, what did you think of that movie? Because I have very mixed feelings about it, and I need someone to talk to about it." And Ben says, "Oh, I have a lot of thoughts. Like the first half was amazing. I was completely hooked. But then the second half just fell apart for me." And Grace says, "Yes, that is exactly how I felt. Like the setup was so good, the characters were interesting, the mystery was compelling, and then the ending just did not deliver on any of those promises." And Ben says, "And the worst part is that the twist at the end felt like it came out of nowhere, like there were no clues earlier in the movie that would have let you figure it out, which for me is what makes a good mystery satisfying." Both people are passionate about the topic, and their follow-up comments are building on each other to create a shared analysis of the movie. Grace's initial comment about having mixed feelings set the stage. Ben's follow-up agreed and divided the movie into two parts. Grace's next follow-up took that division and added specific reasons why the first half was good. And then Ben's follow-up identified exactly what was wrong with the ending. Then Grace says, "You make a really good point about the clues, because I think that is what separates a great mystery from an okay one. It is not about surprising the audience, it is about making the audience feel like they could have figured it out if they had paid closer attention." And Ben says, "Totally. And there is that scene about halfway through where the main character finds the letter. And when I was watching it, I thought that letter was going to be important. But then it was never mentioned again." And Grace says, "Oh my gosh, yes. The letter. I completely forgot about the letter. That is such a good example because it felt like the writers set up something meaningful and then just abandoned it, which makes me think maybe they changed the ending during production and did not go back and fix the earlier scenes." Ben brought up a specific detail, the letter, and Grace's follow-up about the writers possibly changing the ending is a theory that explains the problem they have been discussing. The idea developed from a general feeling of disappointment to a specific analysis of what went wrong to a theory about why it went wrong. Then Ben says, "That actually makes a lot of sense, because I read somewhere that the studio wanted a different ending than the director, and if that is true, it would explain why the movie feels so inconsistent. Like the first half has this clear artistic vision, and the second half feels like it was put together by a committee." And Grace says, "Wow, okay, so now I feel like I understand the movie better, even though I still do not like it. Like, knowing the behind-the-scenes drama actually makes the whole thing make more sense." And Ben says, "Right, it does not fix the movie, but it at least explains it. And honestly, sometimes I find the stories behind movies almost as interesting as the movies themselves." And Grace says, "Me too. Like, remember when we watched that other movie a few months ago and then found out the two lead actors hated each other during filming? It completely changed how I saw their scenes together." Ben added a new piece of information that completely changed how Grace understood the movie. Her follow-up about feeling like she understands it better even though she still does not like it is a really nuanced response that shows she processed the new information and integrated it into her thinking. Then Ben says, "That one was wild, like they had to film all their scenes separately because they refused to be in the same room. And somehow the movie still turned out great. which just shows how good the director was. And Grace says, "It really does, and maybe that is why I am so disappointed by this latest movie. Because when you know what a good director can do even with difficult circumstances, you have higher expectations, and this movie just did not meet them." And Ben says, "I think you just perfectly described why we are both sitting here analyzing this movie instead of just moving on with our lives. It is because we know it could have been good, and that is almost more frustrating than if it had just been bad from the start." And Grace says, "Exactly. Bad movies are easy to forget, but disappointing movies stick with you because they had potential." The conversation has reached a really satisfying conclusion. They started with mixed feelings, explored why they felt that way, discovered information that explained the problems, connected it to other movies they have seen, and arrived at a general principle about why disappointing movies are worse than bad ones. Notice that nobody convinced anybody of anything. They all understood each other's perspectives better and arrived at a shared conclusion that none would have reached alone. When you hear someone's follow-up make you see things differently, real communication is happening. Now let us join a book club meeting with 3 people, Zoe, Marcus, and Iris, discussing a novel they all read. Zoe says, "I have to start by saying that I really struggled with this book, like I kept waiting for something to happen, and it felt like nothing ever did." And Marcus says, "I had the opposite reaction, actually. I loved the slowness of it. It felt like real life, where most days nothing dramatic happens and you just live through the ordinary moments." And Iris says, "I am somewhere in the middle, because there were parts where I found it really beautiful and other parts where I was genuinely bored, and I keep going back and forth on whether I think it is a good book." You immediately have 3 different perspectives, and the follow-up comments are going to show how these 3 people explore their differences and maybe find some common ground. Then Zoe says, "Okay, I can see Marcus's point about it feeling like real life, but for me, when I read a book, I want something different from real life. I want to be taken somewhere unexpected. I want surprises. I want something that makes me think in a way that my normal day does not." And Marcus says, "That is fair, but I would argue that this book did make me think, just not in a dramatic way. Like there is this one scene where the main character is just sitting on a bench watching people walk by, and the description is so detailed that it made me look at my own surroundings differently. Like I actually noticed things on my way to work yesterday that I never notice because I am always rushing." And Iris says, "That scene was beautiful. I completely agree with Marcus on that. And I think maybe that is the problem. The individual scenes are gorgeous, but the book as a whole does not hold together. It is like a collection of beautiful moments that do not add up to a satisfying story." Iris found a way to bridge both perspectives by saying the scenes are beautiful, but the structure does not work. Her follow-up is a classic example of synthesizing different opinions into a new idea that goes beyond what any one person said. Then Zoe says, "Oh, I like that way of putting it. A collection of beautiful moments." Because you are right. There were scenes that I loved individually, like the one with the grandmother in the kitchen. That scene made me cry. But then the next chapter would be something completely different, and I would lose the emotional connection. And Marcus says, and that is actually a valid criticism, I cannot argue with that, because even though I loved the book, I can see that the structure was loose, and maybe it needed a stronger thread connecting all the moments together. And Iris says, exactly. And I wonder if the author did that on purpose. Like maybe the point is that life is a collection of moments that do not necessarily connect in a neat way. But I am not sure if that is brilliant, or if it is just an excuse for poor editing. Marcus acknowledged that the criticism was valid, even though he loved the book. And Iris took the discussion to a meta level by questioning whether the structural problem was intentional, which opened up a whole new dimension. Then Marcus says, that question about whether it was intentional is really interesting, because I think with this kind of literary fiction you can never be sure. Like, is the author a genius who is making a profound point about the nature of human experience? Or did they just write a messy book? And honestly, sometimes I think the answer is both. And Zoe says, I love that. The answer is both, because it takes the pressure off having to decide if the book is good or bad. And it lets you appreciate the parts that worked without having to defend the parts that did not. And Iris says, and maybe that is the perfect way to end this discussion, because we have spent all this time trying to figure out if the book is good or bad. And the real answer is that it is both, and that is okay. Marcus's follow-up about the answer being both gave everyone permission to hold contradictory feelings. Zoe picked up on that and articulated why it was freeing. And Iris brought the discussion to a close by connecting it back to the original question. The whole conversation was a journey from 3 different opinions to a shared understanding, and every step of that journey was paved with follow-up comments that added something new and meaningful. I want you to picture a friend's birthday party now, where 2 people named Ian and Diana have been making small talk for a few minutes. Ian says, "So how do you know the birthday girl?" "Because I have known Sarah since college, but it seems like she has a lot of friends from different parts of her life here tonight." And Diana says, "We actually met at a pottery class about 2 years ago," which sounds random, but we ended up sitting next to each other and just clicked, and now we try to go to a class together every month. And Ian says, "Pottery, that is really cool. I have always wanted to try something like that, but I am not sure I would be any good at it. Like I am one of those people who cannot even draw a straight line." When someone shares an experience, the other person often responds by relating it to their own experience, and very often that involves expressing some kind of doubt or insecurity. This is not selfish behavior. It is actually a way of building connection by showing vulnerability. Then Diana says, "Oh, you should totally try it. Honestly, the classes I go to are completely beginner-friendly. Like, there are people there who have never touched clay before, and the teacher is so patient. She makes everyone feel comfortable." And Ian says, "That is good to hear, because my biggest fear is showing up and everyone else being amazing, and me just sitting there making lopsided bowls while people look at me with pity." And Diana laughs and says, "I promise you that is not how it goes. Like my very first class, I made a cup that was so uneven it could not stand up on its own. I had to lean it against a wall to take a photo of it. And the teacher said it had character." And Ian says, "Okay, now I feel better, because if yours could not stand up, then I might actually have a chance. And honestly, the fact that you kept going after that tells me it is probably not as intimidating as I am making it in my head." Diana's story about the cup that could not stand up did more than any words of encouragement could do, because it gave Ian concrete evidence that it is okay to be bad at pottery in the beginning. Then Diana says, "You know what? Sarah actually mentioned she wants to organize a group pottery night for her birthday next month instead of going to a restaurant. So if that happens, you should definitely come, because you will know me and Sarah, and it will be way less scary than going alone." And Ian says, "That sounds amazing, actually. Like having friendly faces there would make all the difference, and I could always blame Sarah if my bowl comes out terrible." And Diana says, "I am sure she would take that as a compliment. And hey, even if your bowl is a disaster, you will have a fun evening and a good story to tell." Diana used her knowledge of an upcoming event to create an opportunity for Ian to try pottery in a safe environment. Ian responded with humor about blaming Sarah, which kept the tone light. And Diana's final comment reframed potential failure as a source of a good story. Now I want you to listen to a conversation between a landlord and a tenant, Wendy and Raj, who have a friendly relationship. Wendy says, "Hey Raj, I was thinking about the lease renewal coming up next month, and I wanted to talk to you about it before I send anything official, because I wanted to see where your head is at." And Raj says, "Thanks for bringing that up, Wendy. Honestly, I have been thinking about it a lot, because I really like living here and the location is perfect for my commute. But I have to be honest, the rent is starting to feel a bit tight with everything else going up in price." This positive first, problem second structure is a classic pattern in negotiation conversations. Wendy started by being transparent, and Raj's follow-up started positive, but then introduced the problem. Then Wendy says, "I completely understand, and I want you to know that I have not raised the rent since you moved in, which was a conscious decision because you have been a great tenant, you pay on time, you keep the place nice, and I would much rather keep you than try to find someone new." And Raj says, "I really appreciate you saying that, and I had tried to be a good tenant because I respect the fact that this is your property, and you have invested in it. So I want us both to be happy with the arrangement. Both people are showing respect and appreciation before getting into the hard part." Then Wendy says, "So here is what I was thinking. I do need to increase the rent a little bit because my own costs have gone up. But I was thinking something small like $30 a month instead of the market rate increase, which would be closer to $80. And I was hoping that would feel more manageable for you." And Raj says, "$30 I can work with. That feels reasonable given the situation, and I appreciate you not going to the full market rate. But I do have one request, which is that if I agree to this increase, could we look at fixing that bathroom faucet that has been dripping for the last couple of months?" Then Wendy says, "Oh, I had no idea about the faucet. I am sorry about that. Yes, absolutely. I will get that fixed this week. I thought everything was working fine, so thank you for telling me." And Raj says, "No problem. It is just a small drip, but it has been bothering me, and I did not want to bring it up outside of this conversation because it felt like the right time to discuss everything together." And Wendy says, "That makes total sense, and I am glad you brought it up, so it sounds like we have a deal. $30 increase and a new faucet, and I will get the lease renewal paperwork to you by the end of the week." And Raj says, That sounds great, Wendy. Thank you for being so easy to talk to about this. I know these conversations can be awkward, but you made it really painless. Notice how neither person got defensive or emotional, even though they were discussing money and living conditions. The follow-up comments stayed constructive throughout, and when you hear someone using we language in a follow-up comment, it usually means they are trying to build cooperation rather than conflict. Let us go to a park where two people with dogs, Fiona and Ethan, have just met because their dogs started playing together. Fiona says, "Your dog is so cute. What kind is he? Because I have never seen one that looks quite like that." And Ethan says, "Thank you. He is a rescue, so we are not exactly sure. The vet thinks he is a mix of about 4 different breeds, which might explain why he looks like nothing you have ever seen before." And Fiona says, "That is the best kind of dog, honestly. We have a rescue, too. She is the one with the brown and white spots. And when we got her, they told us she was a lab mix, but I am pretty sure there is no lab anywhere in her family tree." Then Ethan says, "I love that. The mystery breed. Because that is half the fun of having a rescue. You get this dog, and you spend the first 6 months trying to figure out what they are, and then you just give up and accept that they are their own thing." And Fiona says, "Completely. Like, I spent way too much money on one of those DNA tests, and it came back with results that made absolutely no sense. It said she was part Chihuahua, and she is like 40 pounds, so either the test is wrong or there is a very large Chihuahua somewhere." And Ethan laughs and says, "Oh no, the DNA test backfire. My sister did the same thing with her dog, and the results said it was mostly wolf, which obviously it is not. It is the friendliest dog I have ever met. It rolls over for belly rubs from strangers." Then Fiona says, "Maybe these DNA tests are just random number generators wrapped in a fancy app, because at this point I trust my own eyes more than I trust the results." And Ethan says, "That is probably wise, and honestly I think the dogs do not care at all about what breed they are. They just care about treats and walks and belly rubs, which is honestly a pretty good philosophy for life." And Fiona says, "My dog would agree with that completely. She has absolutely no identity crisis about her heritage. She just wants to know when dinner is." And Ethan says, "Same with mine. He is the most uncomplicated creature I have ever met. And honestly, I think that is why I love having a dog so much. They remind you that life does not have to be that complicated." The conversation shifted from dog breeds to DNA tests, to dog philosophy, to the impact dogs have on our emotional lives. And when someone shares a personal story or feeling, and the other person responds not with advice or analysis, but with a similar story or feeling of their own, that parallel sharing is one of the most powerful tools in conversation, because it makes the other person feel understood without being judged. Then Fiona says, "I could not agree more. Like some days, I come home from work completely stressed out about deadlines and emails and all this stuff that feels so important in the moment. And then I walk through the door, and my dog is just standing there wagging her tail like I have been gone for a year, and suddenly none of the work stuff matters." And Ethan says, "Yes, that moment when you walk in and they act like you are the greatest person in the world, there is nothing like it. And the crazy thing is, they do that every single day. It never gets old." And Fiona says, "And the fact that they do it every day is what makes it so powerful. Because it is not a special occasion thing, it is just consistent, unconditional happiness to see you. And I think we all need more of that energy in our lives. Now picture two students, Naomi and Oscar, studying for an exam together in a library. Naomi says, "I have been staring at this page for 20 minutes, and I swear the words are not going into my brain, like I read the whole paragraph and then immediately forget what it said." And Oscar says, "Me too. And I think part of the problem is that we have been studying for 3 hours straight without a proper break. Like I read somewhere that your brain can only focus intensely for about 45 minutes before it needs a rest." And Naomi says, "That makes sense, actually, because I was fine for the first hour, but after that, it has been getting progressively harder to concentrate, and now I am basically just moving my eyes across the page without actually processing anything." Then Oscar says, "So should we take a proper break then? Like not just scrolling on our phones, but actually getting up and walking around or something? Because I think the phone break is part of the problem. It is not really giving our brains a rest if we are just feeding them different information." And Naomi says, "That is a really good point, and I actually read an article about this. It said that looking at your phone during a study break is like running a marathon and then cooling down by running a shorter marathon, like it is not actually a break at all." And Oscar says, "I love that analogy, the shorter marathon, because it perfectly describes how I feel after a phone break, like I do not feel rested at all. I just feel distracted in a different way." Then Naomi says, "So what should we do instead? Like if we cannot look at our phones and we cannot sit here, what is the actual right way to take a study break?" And Oscar says, "I think the research says something about going outside or at least looking at something far away. Like your eyes need a change of focus, and your brain needs a change of scenery. So maybe we could walk to the cafe across the street and get a coffee." And Naomi says, "That sounds perfect, actually. And it would get us away from this desk, which I am starting to associate with suffering. Like just looking at these textbooks is making me tense at this point." And Oscar says, "Same. And you know what? I think the fact that we are talking about how to study better is probably more useful than the actual studying we have been doing for the last hour, because at least we are learning something about how our brains work." Then Naomi says, "You might be right about that. And honestly, I think we should build proper breaks into our study schedule from now on, instead of just pushing through when we are tired, because clearly what we are doing right now is not working." And Oscar says, "Absolutely. Like, let us agree on a system, 45 minutes of focused study, and then a 15-minute real break, where we actually leave the room, no phones, just walking or coffee or whatever, and then we come back fresh." And Naomi says, "I am in, and let us start right now by taking our first proper break, because I think my brain has officially gone on strike." The conversation moved from frustration to understanding to planning to reflection, reaching action through thoughtful follow-up comments. Now imagine two friends, Lucy and Amir, planning a trip to a coastal town for a weekend. Lucy says, "I was looking at places to stay, and there are two options that seem good. There is a hotel right on the beach, which is more expensive, but the location is unbeatable. And then there is a little bed and breakfast about 10 minutes walk from the beach, which is cheaper and looks really charming." And Amir says, "Okay, I have thoughts on this, because the hotel sounds amazing, But if we are only staying for 2 nights, the price difference is pretty significant, like it is almost double. And I am wondering if we would actually spend enough time in the room to justify paying that much more. Then Lucy says, that is a fair point. And honestly, we would probably only be in the room to sleep and shower. Like the whole point of this trip is to be outdoors and explore the town and walk on the beach. So maybe the location of the room matters less than I initially thought. And Amir says, right, and the bed and breakfast is only a 10-minute walk, which is nothing. And it might actually be a nicer experience, because bed and breakfasts are more personal. Like the hosts might have good recommendations for restaurants and things to do that you would not get at a hotel. And Lucy says, that is true. I did not think about that, the local knowledge thing, because when we went to that bed and breakfast in the mountains last year, the couple who ran it told us about this hidden waterfall that was not in any guidebook, and that ended up being the highlight of the whole trip. Then Amir says, the hidden waterfall trip was amazing. I forgot about that. And you are right that we would never have found that place without their recommendation. So maybe the bed and breakfast option gives us a better chance of having those kinds of unexpected discoveries on this trip too. And Lucy says, exactly. And I just looked at the reviews for this place, and they are overwhelmingly positive, like multiple people mention the breakfast being incredible, and the hosts being really warm and welcoming, so I think we should go with the bed and breakfast. And Amir says, I am convinced, book it. And hey, the money we save on the room can go toward a really nice dinner on Saturday night, so it is a win all around. Then Lucy says, oh, I love that idea. A nice dinner. And I know there is a seafood place right by the harbor that has amazing reviews, so maybe we can look at the menu and decide if we want to go there or somewhere else. And Amir says, perfect. And you know what? I think this is going to be a really good trip, because the planning part is already fun. Like, just talking about all the things we could do is getting me excited. And Lucy says, me too. And I think that is because we are actually good at planning things together. Like, we do not argue about decisions, we just kind of figure it out by talking through it. And that makes the whole process enjoyable instead of stressful. Then Amir says, I think that comes from practice. Like, remember when we tried to plan that road trip a couple of years ago, and it was a disaster because we could not agree on anything, and we both ended up frustrated. And Lucy says, oh my God, the road trip that never happened, yes, we spent 3 weeks arguing about the route, and then gave up entirely. But I think we learned from that. Like, we figured out that it is better to each share our thoughts and then find the overlap rather than trying to convince each other. And Amir says, exactly. And that is basically what we just did with the accommodation. Like, we both shared our thinking and found the place that made sense for both of us. No convincing needed. And Lucy says, growth. Look at us growing as people and as travel planners. The road trip disaster was actually a valuable learning experience in disguise. The conversation went from comparing hotels to reflecting on friendship and personal growth, and it all happened through follow-up comments that made natural connections. Now listen to two parents, Karen and Mike, waiting to pick up their kids from school. Karen says, I have to ask you something because I have been struggling with this, and I feel like you might have some insight since your kids are a bit older than mine. And Mike says, "Sure, what is going on? I am happy to share whatever wisdom I have. Though I should warn you that most of what I know about parenting I learned by making mistakes first." And Karen says, "Well, that is actually reassuring to hear. But my question is about screen time, because my 8-year-old is constantly asking for more time on the tablet, and I do not know where to draw the line. Like, I do not want to be too strict, because all his friends have tablets too, but I also do not want him staring at a screen all afternoon." Then Mike says, "Okay, so we went through exactly this with our oldest. And what I eventually realized is that the problem was not really about the screen time itself. It was about what the screen time was replacing. Like, if he is playing on the tablet instead of going outside or building things or reading, then yes, it is a problem. But if he has already done all those things, and the tablet is just his downtime, then maybe it is less of an issue." And Karen says, "Oh, that is a really interesting way to think about it, because I have been focusing on the number of minutes he spends on it, when maybe I should be thinking about what he is not doing during those minutes." Then Mike says, "And the other thing that helped us was creating some structure around it. Like, we did not want to be constantly negotiating every day. So we set up a system where screen time happens after homework and after some physical activity. And once those things are done, he gets his tablet time. And there is no arguing about it, because the rules are clear." And Karen says, "I like that idea a lot, because right now it is a daily negotiation, and it is exhausting. Like, every afternoon he asks, and I say not yet, and he asks again 5 minutes later, and it turns into this whole thing that ruins both of our moods." And Mike says, "The daily negotiation is the worst, and I think kids actually prefer having clear rules, even if they push against them at first, because knowing what to expect makes them feel secure, and it takes the pressure off you as the parent to constantly be making decisions." Then Karen says, "You know what? I am going to try that system starting this weekend, homework first, then some activity, then tablet time. And I really appreciate you talking through this with me, because I was starting to feel like I was the only parent who was struggling with this." And Mike says, "You are definitely not the only one, I promise you. Like, every parent I know has some version of this struggle. And honestly, the fact that you are thinking about it this carefully means you are probably doing a better job than you think you are." Advice conversations often follow a pattern of sharing an experience, offering a reframe, suggesting a solution, and offering encouragement. Recognizing this pattern fills in the gaps even if you miss a few words. Now picture two former co-workers, Vanessa and Chris, running into each other at a supermarket. Vanessa says, "Chris, oh my goodness, is that you? I have not seen you since you left the company. How have you been?" And Chris says, "Vanessa, wow, it has been what, over a year now? I have been great, actually, really great. The new job is going well, and honestly, leaving was the best decision I have made in a long time." And Vanessa says, "I am so glad to hear that, because when you told me you were leaving, I remember thinking that was really brave. Like, leaving a stable job to go to a startup is not something everyone would do." Then Chris says, "It felt brave at the time, but honestly, I was so miserable at the old job that it was more like survival than bravery. Like, I was not taking a risk by leaving, I was taking a risk by staying, because I could feel myself getting more and more unhappy every month, and I knew if I did not make a change, it was going to affect my health. And Vanessa says, I had no idea you were that unhappy, because you always seemed fine at work, like you were always professional and got your work done, and I never heard you complain, which makes me wonder how many other people around me might be struggling without showing it. Then Chris says, that is a really good question. And I think the answer is probably a lot more than we realize, because there is this culture at work where you are supposed to leave your problems at the door and just perform. And I was really good at performing. Like, nobody knew I was dreading coming in every morning because I smiled and did my job and said good morning to everyone. And Vanessa says, and that is exactly the problem, because we create these environments where people feel like they cannot be honest about how they are doing, and then we are surprised when someone suddenly quits or has a breakdown. But the signs were probably there the whole time if anyone had been paying attention. Then Chris says, you are absolutely right. And the irony is that after I left and started talking to people about why, so many colleagues reached out privately to say they felt the same way, but were too afraid to say anything while we were still working together, which told me everything I needed to know about the culture there. And Vanessa says, wow, that is both sad and validating. Sad because so many people were unhappy and felt they could not speak up, but validating because it confirms that your decision to leave was the right one, even if it felt scary at the time. Then Chris says, exactly. And it also made me realize that when I start my next team, whenever that happens, I want to create an environment where people feel safe enough to say when something is wrong, because the cost of silence is just too high. And Vanessa says, I think that is a wonderful goal, and honestly hearing you talk about this is making me think about my own situation too, because I have been feeling a bit stuck lately, but I have been telling myself it is not that bad, and I should just be grateful to have a job. But maybe I am doing the same thing you were doing, performing fine, while actually being unhappy underneath. And Chris says, I cannot answer that for you, but I can tell you that the phrase not that bad was basically my motto for 2 years. And in my experience, not that bad is a really dangerous place to be, because it is uncomfortable enough to make you unhappy, but not uncomfortable enough to make you do anything about it. So you just stay there indefinitely. Then Vanessa says, not that bad is a dangerous place. I am going to write that down, because it perfectly describes where I am right now, and I think maybe this random encounter at the supermarket is exactly what I needed today. Because sometimes you do not realize you are stuck until someone holds up a mirror for you. And Chris says, I know exactly what you mean, and hey, if you ever want to talk more about it, maybe over coffee instead of in the cereal aisle, I am always happy to listen. And I can tell you all the messy details of my transition that I left out of the inspiring version. And Vanessa laughs and says, I would love that. And yes, let us get coffee, because I definitely want the messy details. Those are always the most useful ones. The language here was simple, but the ideas were profound. That is where real power lives in English. Now I want you to experience a group of 3 friends having lunch together: Tara, Neil, and Pete, because group conversations have a different rhythm. Tara says, so what is everyone doing this weekend? because I have absolutely nothing planned, and I feel like I should do something fun instead of just sitting at home again. And Neil says, I am thinking about going to that new market that opened downtown. I heard they have really good street food and some local artists selling their work, and I have been meaning to check it out for weeks. And Pete says, oh, I saw a video about that market online. It looked really cool, but it also looked super crowded. Like the video showed massive lines for the food stalls, and I am not sure I have the patience for that. Someone suggests something, and someone else raises a concern. Then Tara says, the crowds could be an issue, but maybe if we go early in the morning it would be less busy. Like I noticed on their website they open at 8, and I feel like most people would not show up until 10 or 11. And Neil says, that is smart. I would be up for going early. And honestly, the food would probably be fresher too if we get there right when they start cooking. So there might actually be an advantage to going early beyond just avoiding crowds. And Pete says, okay, you have both convinced me. Early morning market trip it is, but I have one condition, which is that we get coffee first because I am not a functional human being before caffeine. Then Tara says, coffee first is a great idea. There is actually a really nice coffee shop 2 blocks from the market that I have been wanting to try. So we could meet there at 7:30, have coffee, and then walk to the market when it opens at 8. And Neil says, perfect. And while we are at the market, I want to look at the art stalls too, because I need a gift for my mom's birthday coming up. And something handmade and local would be much better than another generic store-bought thing. And Pete says, oh, your mom's birthday is coming up too. Mine is next month and I have no idea what to get her. So maybe we can brainstorm while we are walking around. Then Tara says, I love that we are turning this into a whole morning adventure. And I just realized I have been saying I have nothing planned for the weekend. And now I have a fully scheduled morning, which is exactly what I needed, without knowing I needed it. And Neil says that is the best kind of planning, when it happens accidentally just by talking to people, because trying to plan everything in advance always feels forced, but this just feels easy. And Pete says, completely easy. And that is why I think the three of us work well together. Because nobody is trying to control the plan. We are just throwing ideas out and seeing what sticks. In group conversations, ideas bounce around in a more complex pattern, and sometimes 2 people will exchange several comments, while the third person listens. Then the third person will jump back in, connecting to something earlier. Every comment is still adding information, perspective, emotion, or humor. You just have to be patient in tracking where the thread is. Listen now to a couple, Brooke and Darren, sitting in a park having a slightly difficult conversation. Brooke says, can we talk about something that has been on my mind lately? Because I do not want to make it a big deal, but I also do not want to ignore it. And Darren says, of course, you can talk to me about anything. What is going on? And Brooke says, well, I have just been feeling like we spend almost every moment together, which I love, but I also feel like I have not seen my friends in weeks, and I am starting to miss them. And I feel guilty even saying that, because it sounds like I am saying, I want to spend less time with you, which is not what I mean at all. Brooke stated her feeling clearly, but immediately anticipated how it might be misinterpreted and clarified what she did not mean. Then Darren says, "Thank you for telling me that, and I want you to know that I do not feel like you are saying you want to spend less time with me. I hear what you are actually saying, which is that you need balance. And that makes total sense because I have actually been feeling something similar, but I did not want to bring it up because I was afraid it would sound like I did not want to be around you." And Brooke says, "Wait, really? You have been feeling the same way?" Because that actually makes me feel so much better. Then Darren says, "Yeah, I have been feeling like I need a little more time for my hobbies too. Like, I have not played guitar in weeks, and I used to play every day. And I think part of the reason I have been feeling a bit off lately is that I am neglecting the things that make me feel like me, if that makes sense." And Brooke says, "It makes complete sense. And I think what happens is that when we start dating someone we really like, we naturally want to spend all our time with them, which is wonderful at first. But then, after a while, we start losing the parts of our lives that made us interesting in the first place. And that is not good for us or for the relationship." Then Darren says, "That is so true. And I think the irony is that the things that make us interesting to each other are the things we do outside of the relationship. Like you love hearing me play guitar, and I love hearing you talk about your painting class. So if we stop doing those things, we actually become less interesting to each other." And Brooke says, "You just nailed it. So maybe we should make a rule. Like 2 nights a week we do our own thing, no pressure to hang out, just do whatever we want separately, and then the other nights we are together and we actually have things to talk about." Emotional conversations use simpler language but carry deeper meaning. So focus on feeling the emotion rather than understanding every word. Now picture a customer named Yuki in a vintage clothing shop run by Ronnie. Yuki says, "Excuse me, I was wondering if you could help me find something specific, because I am going to a 1970s themed party next weekend, and I have no idea where to start." And Ronnie says, "Oh, I love a 70s theme. You came to the right place. Let me look at you for a second. Okay, so you have a great frame for this era. Like the 70s was all about flow and comfort and natural colors. And I think we should start with something like a maxi dress, or maybe some high-waisted flares with a nice blouse." Then Yuki says, "A maxi dress could work. I have not worn one before, but I am open to trying something new, though I am a bit worried about the length, because I am not very tall, and I do not want to trip over myself all night." And Ronnie says, "That is a valid concern, but the trick with maxi dresses is that the hem should just touch the top of your foot, not drag on the floor, and we can always get it shortened if needed. But let me pull a few options and you can try them on." After trying them on, Ronnie says, "Oh, that orange one on you is absolutely gorgeous. Like the color brings out the warmth in your skin, and the cut is perfect for your shape." And Yuki says, "Really? Because I feel a little like I am wearing a curtain. Like it is so much fabric compared to what I normally wear, and I am not sure if I am pulling it off or if I just look ridiculous." People often use self-deprecating humor in follow-up comments when they feel insecure, looking for reassurance. Then Ronnie says, "I promise you, do not look like a curtain. You look like you stepped out of a 70s magazine. And I think the reason you feel weird is just that it is different from your normal style. But that is the whole point of a costume party. You get to be someone different for a night. And honestly, sometimes stepping outside your comfort zone is where you find the best version of how you look. And Yuki says, okay, when you put it like that, it makes me feel better. So I think I will go with the orange one. And can I also look at some accessories? Service conversations have a practical layer and a social layer, and the follow-up comments carry the social layer. Listen to two siblings, Holly and Ryan, talking about their parents getting older. Holly says, "Have you talked to Mom lately? Because I called her yesterday, and she mentioned that she has been having trouble with her knees again. And she said it so casually, like it was nothing, but I could hear in her voice that it is bothering her more than she is letting on." And Ryan says, "Yeah, Dad mentioned something similar last week. He said she has been slowing down on her walks, and she does not want to admit that it is because of the pain. And he is worried, but he also says she does not want to go to the doctor about it." Then Holly says, "That sounds exactly like Mom. She is the most stubborn person I know when it comes to asking for help. Like she spent her whole life taking care of everyone else. And now that she needs someone to take care of her, she just cannot accept it." And Ryan says, "And Dad is the same way in his own way. Like he will help Mom with things, but he will not tell us when he is struggling either. And I think they are both trying to protect us from worrying. But the result is that we worry more because we know something is wrong, but we do not know how wrong." Then Holly says, "So what do we do? Because I do not want to be the bossy older sister who calls a family meeting and tells them what to do. But I also do not want to wait until something serious happens." And Ryan says, "I think we need to talk to them together. Like, not as an intervention, but just as a conversation where we say, 'We love you, and we are worried, and we want to help.'" And Holly says, "That is a good approach, and maybe we can frame it around wanting to spend more time with them rather than around their health problems. Like we could say, we want to come over more often and help with things around the house." Then Ryan says, "I think that could work. And I have been thinking for a while that I should visit more often anyway. Like they are not going to be around forever, and I do not want to look back and regret not spending enough time with them." And Holly says, "I feel exactly the same way. And I think this knee thing is actually a wake-up call for both of us. Because it is easy to get caught up in our own lives and forget that our parents are getting older. And maybe this is just the first of many things we are going to have to deal with as they age, and we need to be ready for it together." These hard conversations have universal emotion that comes through even with imperfect words. Finally, I want you to picture two strangers, Fiona and Dev, sitting next to each other on a long train journey. Fiona says, "So are you traveling for work or pleasure? Because I am on my way back from visiting my sister, and I am exhausted, but it was worth it." And Dev says, "Pleasure, sort of. I am coming back from a music festival which was amazing, but my ears are still ringing, and my feet feel like they have been through a war. So I am a mix of happy and destroyed." And Fiona says, "Oh, I love that description, happy and destroyed, because that is exactly how you should feel after a music festival. Like if you come back feeling fresh, then you did not do it right." Then Dev says, "I completely agree. And the weird thing is that this festival was not even the biggest one I have been to. Like it was relatively small, maybe 5,000 people. But the energy was just different. Like everyone was there because they genuinely loved the music, not because it was the trendy thing to do. And Fiona says, that makes sense, because the smaller events often have a better vibe, like my sister took me to a tiny folk festival in her town last year, and there were maybe 200 people in a field, and it was one of the best weekends of my life. Then Dev says, 200 people in a field. That sounds magical, actually, because at the festival I just came from, even 5,000 felt like a lot sometimes. Like during the headline act, the crowd was so dense that I could barely move, and there was this moment where I just stopped trying to get closer and stood at the back and closed my eyes and just listened. And honestly, it was one of the best moments of the whole weekend. And Fiona says, I love that, standing at the back and closing your eyes, because I think sometimes we get so caught up in trying to be as close as possible to the experience that we forget we can actually have the experience from wherever we are, like the music does not care where you are standing. It sounds the same whether you are in the front row or the back. Then Dev says, that is such a good way to put it. The music does not care where you are standing. And I think that applies to a lot of things in life, actually. Like we are always trying to get closer to something, a better job, a bigger house, more followers, whatever it is, and maybe the thing itself does not care about our proximity. Maybe the experience of it is the same regardless. And Fiona says, wow, okay, we just went from a music festival to a life philosophy in about 30 seconds, but you are completely right. And I think that is why I like talking to strangers on trains, because you never know where the conversation is going to go. And sometimes you end up thinking about something in a way you never have before. Then Dev says, I was just thinking the same thing, because I almost put my headphones on when I sat down, which is my usual thing on long journeys, but something made me just say hello instead. And I am so glad I did, because this has been the best part of the weekend, honestly, better than some of the concerts. And Fiona says, that is high praise, given that you were at a music festival, but I know what you mean, because there is something special about a conversation that just flows, where you do not have to try, you just say what you are thinking, and the other person gets it, and adds to it, and it builds into something you could never have planned. And Dev says, exactly. And I think that is probably the same feeling as the music you were talking about. Like, it does not matter where you are, front row or back row. What matters is that you are actually there and paying attention and letting it happen. Then Fiona says, I think we just became friends, and we do not even know each other's last names. But that seems exactly right for a conversation like this. And Dev laughs and says, it does. And maybe that is another lesson from the music. You do not need to know everything about a song to love it. You just need to let it play. And Fiona says, that might be the best thing anyone has ever said to me on a train. And with that, I think our conversation has reached its perfect ending. So I am going to close my eyes and let it settle, like you did at the concert. And Dev says, and I am going to do the same. And it was really nice meeting you, Fiona, without a last name. And Fiona says, nice meeting you too, Dev, without a last name. Two strangers met on a train, exchanged follow-up comments that were genuine and thoughtful and creative, and ended up having a conversation that both of them will remember. That is the power of follow-up comments. That is the power of really listening and really responding. Let me pull together everything we have explored together into something you can hold on to. You learned that follow-up comments are the engine of conversation, and without them, people just exchange isolated statements. You learn to recognize different types of follow-up comments, adding information, adding perspective, adding emotion, asking a question, making a connection, adding humor, and offering a reframe. You learned to listen for signal phrases that tell you a follow-up is coming, phrases like, "the thing is," honestly, or "that reminds me." You learned that in group conversations, the ideas bounce around in a more complex pattern, and you need to track topic shifts rather than just counting turns. You learned that emotional conversations use simpler language but carry deeper meaning, so you should focus on feeling the emotion rather than understanding every word. You learned that service conversations have a practical layer and a social layer, and the follow-up comments carry the social layer. And you learned that the best conversations happen when both people stop trying to control the direction and just give genuine follow-up comments that build on each other naturally. The skill of following follow-up comments is not just an English skill, it is a human skill. It is the skill of being present in a conversation, of caring about what the other person is saying, of being curious about where the ideas might go. English is just the vehicle, and the destination is better human connection. Thank you for being here with me through this entire journey. If this has helped you, please subscribe to English in Fluency and share it with anyone you know who is learning English. Leave a comment telling me your biggest takeaway from everything we have practiced together. You keep showing up, and I will keep making lessons that push your English forward. Take care of yourself. Be kind to yourself as you learn. And I will see you in the next lesson. You have got this.